Welcome to the TheWaterChannel Podcast, a series of conversations on water, food, and agriculture. We feature stories and insights that reflect our present and are shaping our future. I am Abraham Abhishek.
And I am Long Huang. In this episode, we talk about how the COVID pandemic is affecting farmers. To be very specific, women smallholder farmers. We zoom into 3 countries of India, Algeria, and Morocco, and see how farmers are dealing with many severe impacts of the COVID-19.
Long, how are you holding up? I hope you're staying at home, washing your hands, taking all precautions.
Yes, thank you very much, Abraham. I am doing fine. Thankfully, our jobs are the kind that we can do on our computers and from home. Deep respect, though, to the frontline workers. Hats off to the doctors, nurses, teachers, and policemen who continue to go out, day in, day out, making sure that the society does not come to a complete halt.
And deep respect to farmers too, because everything else can pause, but we do need food on our table at the end of the day, pandemic or no pandemic. I mean, farmers don't live among us in cities, so they are a bit out of sight, out of mind. But the fact is that every time I have put on my mask and walked to the market, I have been able to buy fruits and vegetables and milk and grains. And that probably means that there are farmers who have been going to their farms all through the pandemic. They have not hung back and decided to take a break.
True, but it is not like the pandemic has not affected the farmers. All across the world, they have had to deal with lockdowns and their movements have been severely restricted. I mean, they need to go and buy inputs like seeds and fertilizers, and when the markets have been closed, they simply could not do so. And let us not overlook labor. Quite often, farmers have to hire people to work on their farms or offer themselves as hired labor. The lockdown put all of these to a stop. Farmers have less help on their farms.
True, and this has been especially difficult for smallholder farmers, smaller farms, compared to, large agribusinesses.
Yes, and there's a question here, actually. How significant are the smallholders farmers, by the way? Of all the farmers in the world, what percentage are we talking about?
90%, as in 90% of all farmers in the world are smallholder farmers. So the problems of smallholder farmers are the problems of all farmers. And even among smallholder farmers, women smallholder farmers are especially badly hit by the pandemic. For this episode, we spoke to a group of researchers who specialize in smallholder farming in India, Algeria, and Morocco. Last year, in 2020, as the COVID pandemic was still unfolding, they continued to talk to smallholder farmers in these countries and have painted a very comprehensive picture of how the pandemic affected them.
Welcome to this episode of the TheWaterChannel Podcast on the COVID-19 and smallholder farmers.
Let's meet our guests.
My name is Lisa Bossenbroek. I'm from the University of Koblenz-Landau in Germany and also connected to the NGO Targa in Morocco.
I am Hind Ftouhi. I'm from the Agronomy and Veterinary Institute, Hassan de Morocco, and I'm also connected to the Targa aid organization.
I'm Sneha Bhat. I work with SOPPECOM, which is based in Pune, India.
Hamamouche from Algeria. I'm doctor in water management, and I'm working as a consultant in Algerian office in Algeria.
I'm Irene Leonardelli. I'm based at IHE Delft, Institute for Water Education in Delft, in the Netherlands. And I am a PhD fellow in water governance and feminist political ecology.
Let's get right to it. My first question is, how does COVID affect farmers? How does it affect their lives? Do they stock up on toilet paper? Do they start working from home? Do they start doing a lot of Zoom calls? How does it work for them?
Small-scale farmers, especially the ones depending on the market for selling their products, were very much affected, particularly by the consequences of the lockdown. When markets closed and mobility was constrained, because they could no longer easily sell their produce or reach the farms where they work or the workplaces where they usually go and work as agricultural laborers. Moreover, it's also important to to emphasize that small-scale farmers already faced many other challenges, many other problems, for instance, in relation to water shortages. So they were somehow doubly affected. So yeah, in general, it has been very challenging. It has been a very challenging year for many small-scale farmers. At least this is what we have seen documented in the countries where we work, in India, Algeria, and Morocco.
Why the emphasis on smallholder farmers, though?
So why the focus on smallholder farmers is that we've seen in the three countries that they play a central role in providing food for the national economy. For example, in the case of Morocco, like the big cities, Casablanca, Rabat, Tanger, they all rely on small-scale farmers, or also on larger farmers, but the importance of small-scale farmers should not be recognized. We were already working in the three countries, on processes of agrarian change before the COVID-19 pandemic. And we knew how small-scale farmers were already dealing with so many entangled challenges and uncertainties, and that they belong to the poorest section of the rural population in the three countries. So once the pandemic arrived, we therefore very much wondered, they already face certain challenges. So on top of that, how do they deal with the new challenges related to the pandemic?
When we say smallholder farmers, how small are we talking about? For example, what are smallholder farmers in India, in Algeria, in Morocco?
So in India, the women who are involved in this study have land holdings around, say, 1 hectares, not more than that. And the land either belongs to them or somebody in the family. So many women are also cultivating, family-owned land, which is not necessarily in their own name.
For Morocco, small farmer that are farmers who have just a couple of hectares, and with this farmer, the part or the major part of the production is for the family consumption, and the rest they sell it in local markets in order to have money to provide for the family.
Okay.
Algeria, in the same of the Morocco, the plots of the farms is less than 2 hectares by farmers, and in the Mzabbal. So the farmer practices agriculture, diversified agriculture, not only for commercial crops but also for consumption.
Among smallholder farmers, you chose to focus on women smallholder farmers. Why was that?
So half of the people involved in small-scale agriculture are women. Women also do most of the time-consuming, tedious work in agriculture, like sowing and weeding, and yet they are not recognized as farmers because that identity is tied with land ownership. And when it comes to owning land and other resources, the picture is, quite different. So, for example, in Maharashtra state, according to the agriculture census, the total operational landholders of total operational landholders, only 15% are women. So in spite of laws, social and cultural norms often dispossess women from their right to property and especially land, and which means that they don't get access to other resources like irrigation, credit, and government schemes. Single women are, even more marginalized in this scenario as they face social stigma and often violence, and have to take responsibility for agriculture and family single-handedly. As far as India case study is concerned, so this is the group with whom we have been, working for last few years, and especially widows from suicide-affected households in Maharashtra. And in our initial discussions when lockdown started, we realized that the pandemic was increasing their vulnerability, and that's why we decided to focus on this particular group for this study.
You mentioned suicide affected households. Could you expand upon that? Is that a widespread phenomenon in that part of the country, that part of the world, suicides?
Yes. Maharashtra state has the largest number of farmer suicides in India. So according to the National Crime Record Bureau, we have had some 75,000 farmer suicides so far in Maharashtra. And especially there are 14 districts which are declared as suicide affected districts in Maharashtra. They are in the Marathwada and Vidarbha region of the state, which is the cotton growing area. Marathwada is also the drought prone area of the state. And we have been working with the women from these households, the widows from the farm suicide affected households for past 2-3 years now. Yeah.
Interesting. It is very clear. So far, COVID is not the only challenge. There are also other related challenges. And then we also hear that COVID is viewed as something maybe new. What makes it new as a challenge for the community that you are working with? How it is different comparing to, for example, drought or salinization or other challenges that are experiencing now?
I think the main challenges were posed by the restrictions related to the lockdown. So the fact that suddenly farmers' markets were closed in the city was something extremely new and challenging for farmers who could no longer sell some of the produce they produce for the market. So all the investments they had made to cultivate commercial crops for the local markets, they were no longer profitable. They faced huge losses. So many farmers had to let their produce rot in the farms because there were no middlemen that were reaching the villages and buy the produce and then transport it to the city markets where they would sell it. So part of the produce, of course, farmers they consume it within the household. Some maybe they were able to sell or give away to neighbors, other villagers, but they also faced problems in terms of really selling the produce. So maybe they had to sell it at a very, very low rate because the demand was much lower. And in the worst cases, they had to let it rot in the farms.
Yeah, I agree with you, Irene. Even if small farmers and the laborers already have problems, what is new with the pandemic and the lockdown is that it has exacerbated inequalities. For example, for female agricultural wage workers, they have been obliged to go out and to work despite the restrictions and to fear of being sick and to bring the virus to their family because they are obliged to provide for their families, and especially when they do not succeed in having the government support.
In the Mzab Valley in Algeria, the prices of dates dropped significantly. So farmers face difficulties to sell dates of Degletnor varieties, which is mainly produced in the new agriculture extension, especially for commercial purposes. So to escape the monopoly of intermediaries who have a strong grip of the marketing price, small-scale farmers usually store this variety of date in cooling stations. This way, they can sell them for better prices through the year. So, however, last year in October, when the new dates were ready to be harvested, the cooling stations were still packed with the harvest of the season 2019 because the border traffic remained limited since March 2020. So markets were closed and festivities and family gathering prohibited. So as a consequence, many farmers had to sell large quantities of Degletnor at low prices to large local food processing companies in order to save some storage capacity of this year's harvest. And the second impact of the pandemic concern the livability and the wage of laborers. Indeed, in both valley, in Algeria, the harvest of date and relies on local and regional workers. So last year, mobility restriction led to prohibition of gathering and a lack of labor's availability.
You guys have already begun to answer this, but could you talk a bit about how women farmers' experiences of the pandemic were different from those of the male farmers?
At the moment we wrote this paper differently from Morocco and Algeria and India. In Algeria, we had not direct contact with women farmers and laborers because of patriarchal norms characterizing the Mozambique community. So we were not able to get in touch with the women remotely.
Also in the 3 different countries, so we also focused on agricultural laborers. And so, for example, in the case of Morocco, like the new emerging forms of agriculture, they very much rely on the availability of cheap labor, much of which is provided by women. And these are often women who are landless, who are divorced, single, or widowed. So also in terms of social category, they're often socially less considered. And these women, they often work in the agricultural sector to be able to care for their children, to care for their family members in terms of providing food, shelter, health, education. Yet they're often not considered as main earners. So they often also don't have a contract or neither social security. So already in the agricultural model that recently emerged in Morocco, they are a social category that is invisible and very, very fragile because of these precarious work conditions. So because of the lockdown, they couldn't travel anymore to their workplaces. Because often they take a collective bus to travel like 20, 30 kilometers away from their from their house, sorry. So they couldn't do that. They also often did not benefit from the government support programs that were put in place because these government support programs, they are aimed at the male or at the main provider of the households. And since these women are not considered as the main provider, and they kind of lose out there.
What were some of the ways in which smallholder farmers or smallholder women farmers in particular coped with the situation? You mentioned in your paper how some of them devised certain strategies and workarounds to deal with the lockdowns. Could you talk a bit about that?
Many farmers who had suffered losses during the lockdown and were, still uncertain about the coming year, dealt with the situation by making a change in their cropping pattern. So agriculture year starts in June in India. And so last year, we saw many women, we talked with, shifted from commercial crops like flowers and cotton to subsistent crops like millets, pulses, and groundnuts. Another thing is we were able to start a conversation with women about more sustainable farming and food and nutrition security in this background. So around 200 women farmers associated with our network who had experienced vegetables and shortage during the lockdown developed these small chemical-free kitchen gardens during the monsoon and the season, for the food security of their own families.
And perhaps if I can add something about the Moroccan case, and especially about the landless women I just talked about. So for them, how they dealt with the situation is to find work in their network. So they would start farming on neighboring farms, so they also would avoid and these collective transport means, and so that they would not get infected, but also working secretly. There was a lot of police control during the lockdown and a ban on gatherings. And they would try to take secondary roads to avoid the police or meet very early in the morning, like for example at 3. And so to kind of gather in spots where farmers would go to. And so they would go before the police would actually be on the roads. So this is how they try to find a way of earning some money, but also they try to alternative work. So working in houses, starting cleaning work, or try to find other sources of income.
Like women farmers who are single or divorced and landless, they had no other option but work secretly or find other ways to earn an income. But other farmers who were more resourceful and had better financial means, they could come up with inventive ways, other ways to deal with the situation, not only changes in cropping patterns, but for instance, we documented a very nice story in Algeria of a community that managed to restore an old irrigation system.
Some farmers we interviewed told us that they decide to reduce the expenses of farming by using, for example, local agriculture inputs, such as local seeds and manure, or recycling all the inputs, for example, all the dry lines of irrigation. So we also documented collective initiatives. So, for example, in one of the oases of Mzab, Benizgen Oasis, farmers came together to restore the long disrupted irrigation system in the village. So they raised the funds and worked collectively to restore 22 wells during the first month of lockdown, in order to counteract water scarcity and give a new life to a traditional irrigation system.
Yeah, just to complete what Farah said, we also noted in Morocco that the emergence of local collective initiative. For example, in the Dar'a Valley, young people organized a campaign to collect money through WhatsApp groups and Facebook groups, and in order to help needy families and farmers whose wells have dried up, and because that affects their ability to produce and to have money to provide for their family. So this crisis shows us that farmers don't access much to government supports. That's why they should work together and call their friends for help.
We've also seen individual actions by local farmers in the Moroccan context. And so young farmers who are producing watermelons. So they have, for example, reduced the pesticides, the amount of pesticides that they use, but also use secondhand agricultural materials. They use less water to irrigate the watermelons. Also, these are more economic incentives or reasons why they do such adaptations. But I think in terms of environmental impacts, these are very interesting adaptations that can also are inspiring beyond the COVID crisis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if I can add something for India, very much related to what Sneha was saying before, the fact that many farmers decided to cultivate more subsistence crops, so crops for self-consumption, for the family consumption rather than for the market, was definitely inspiring, because cultivating these subsistence crops, which are often also traditional local crops, make these small scale farmers more self-sufficient, less dependent on large food production and distribution chains. So in a way, they become more resilient, because in times of crisis, in times in which these food production and distribution chains get disrupted, for instance, because of the lockdown, they have the means to provide for themselves and for their families, and also to enhance and give space to local knowledges and use local resources, such as local seeds, or, as Farah was saying, manure, and use seeds that are grown locally rather than depend on the market. So that is definitely in a way positive. Or all these women that were supported to start kitchen gardens, to cultivate vegetables for their consumption, and especially chemical free or agroecological oriented kitchen gardens. These are definitively positive initiatives that, we hope they will continue beyond this pandemic, beyond this crisis.
It seems that going back to the subsistence food system to be a trend in India, and I think that says a lot about the potential for improving the resilience of the rural system. I am curious how it is in the other countries, Morocco and Algeria. Do you see the same trend, and how is it different from the story that we hear in India?
So what we've seen in the Moroccan situation, with the watermelon producers, these are often young farmers that cultivate on approximately less than 10 hectares, but often more, or often even less than 5 hectares, they cultivate watermelon. So they also have start diversifying. So they also plant different crops for their own consumption. So different vegetables. But this was something that was already done prior to the COVID pandemic. But we've seen that because of these farming practices, they've been also less impacted by the COVID pandemic. So the closure of the markets, of the vegetable markets, and they've been less affected by that because they produce their own products. That on the one hand, but what we also have encountered is that the small scale farmers are more in the oasis that engage more in subsistence farming. They often rely on a diversified kind of income. So not only agriculture, but also the tourist activity has been very important for them, and but also children migrating to the city. And so their income is composed by different kinds of activities. And that has been very much affected by the COVID pandemic, because in the valley, the whole tourist sector is kind of, it doesn't exist anymore, has been very much impacted. So now they rely fully on agriculture, or also on the income of children who have been migrated to the city. But sometimes these also have lost their jobs. And so this diversification, which is very important for the resilience of the farmers, has been very much affected, actually.
So in the 3 countries that you talk about, it is clear that a majority of agriculture is smallholder agriculture. And at the same time, it is the smallholder agriculture that seems to be the most vulnerable to shocks like COVID, and maybe also shocks like droughts and slow burning changes like climate change. Given that, would it be right to say that large scale agribusinesses are the future of agriculture? And going ahead, what is the value of smallholder farming? to agriculture in these countries, to food security in these countries?
In Morocco, small farms represent almost 70% of total landholds, and small farmers are the ones who feed the country, not the big farmers. While, for example, high valued added agriculture had negative ecological impact, and it's also intended for export, not to feed the cities or other rural communities. So, in terms of food security, I think this category or small holders are very important for many reasons.
We have noticed in the three countries where we work that large agribusinesses have had in the past years a lot of capacity to access and use and really overexploit groundwater resources, and this has been a huge problem in certain areas for small-scale farmers who are dealing more and more with issues of water scarcity, and they don't have the same capacity of large businesses to dig very deep wells and access water. Traditional knowledges get lost. The traditional seeds are not cultivated as they used to. A big problem there, or not a problem, but like many people who are increasingly suffering and marginalized. So there is a need to rethink this way of producing food and selling food, and maybe think more about decentralized markets and encouraging farmers to, in a more agroecological way, local seeds, subsistence seeds, what we were also mentioning before.
In Algeria, for example, the recent agriculture development programs have established new agriculture oriented toward intensive farming, so agribusiness, through the use of energy inefficient pumping in order to achieve food self-sufficiency and to reduce the cost of import, especially cereals. So in the Sahara, this agriculture model has caused a lot environmental problem. For example, the decline of deep groundwater, degradation of the quality of shallow groundwater, and other problems. So, regardless of this program, so the oasis communities have developed another agriculture model on the land surrounding the ancient oasis, so at the periphery of the old oasis. So, and it's interesting to see that this agriculture is based on the combination of the traditional knowledge inherited from old oasis. For example, circular irrigation system may also use of natural fertilizer and the modern or contemporary farming practices. For example, drip irrigation, water inefficient crops, in order to produce a healthier and more sustainable market agriculture. So I think that this local reinvention of this practice, or practice combined of the modern agricultural practice, so the circular system is in the peripheral of extension of oasis extensions may hold important lesson for other farming communities or farming model, especially in Algerian Sahara.
You had not planned to do this piece of research, had you? You were already working in these countries on the ground in these particular research areas, and then COVID struck, and then you had to stop and go back home. And it was at some point when things were still locked down, when you started this research by talking to farmers remotely and by talking to each other remotely. Could you talk a bit about that?
When the lockdown started last year, when the pandemic started in the different countries, we were all conducting field work in different rural contexts in India, Morocco, and Algeria. And we suddenly all were back home in different countries, but having to work remotely, work from home, and rethink about how to conduct research. At the same time, we were very concerned about the situation and how the pandemic and the lockdown were going to affect the people we were engaging with in our research activism work. So we felt we really wanted to remain engaged and monitor the situation, but also somehow document, like listen to their voices and document their voices, so that to somehow make sure their voices can reach other actors like the government, and point out who within this crisis is most affected, who is further marginalized, and try to reflect together on how these marginalizations can be addressed. So we started a discussion, and we got some funding from the TWC, which was also a nice way for us to remain engaged, work together, share reflections and concerns, and have regularly these Zoom meetings in which we would discuss and share insights from our different research areas, which was very important and beautiful in times in which we were all working from home, kind of isolated and disconnected from our colleagues and workplaces and research areas.
We decide to remain engaged with these communities because we have to work with them before the pandemic, the coronavirus, and before the lockdown. And that's why we start to conduct phone interviews with different actors to know how they are dealing this crisis, and how they are facing the consequences of the lockdown. In the case of women or agricultural laborers, sometimes they don't feel comfortable to share why their husband or other member of the family is next to them. And in this regard, we were not able to, for example, to address some issues which are considered to be sensitive. For example, with the female laborers, it was difficult to address subjects such as domestic violence or violence in exploitations or farms. And another point is that by phone, it was more difficult to gain the trust of people we did not know before the pandemic started.
So in both Algeria and Morocco, so we took advantage of the lifting of travel restriction to return to the field after a year of remote field work. So we had mixed findings. Of course, we were excited to resume our activities, normal activities, and be physically in the field after such as a long time. But we also had worries that the COVID-19 situation is changing quickly everywhere. So, for example, in Algeria, it was very difficult to establish a relationship of trust with certain actors by phone. For example, with undocumented sub-Saharan workers and Oasis women, because of conservative norms and tradition. So, being back in the field, I able to conduct face-to-face interviews, made it possible to get in touch with these people. So they were more at ease to engage with us and share their stories.
Doing field work remotely or by face-to-face situation in time of crisis is very important, because it changed the relationship between the researcher and the interviewees. For example, because the interactions go beyond the simple collecting of empirical data. for example, in our case, we were very affected by what the female laborers, the small farmers are living by the crisis, the challenges they had in regularly. And we feel the responsibility to help them, of course, within the limits of our means. Yeah, it's a kind of, I don't know how to express it, but we are collecting data, but is that enough? And another point is that this crisis or doing this project, it has also brought us closer to our colleagues in India, in Algeria, and with Iran, in different countries. And we because we hold regular meetings and work sessions, and we learn a lot from each other and a lot from different situations in rural context in India and Algeria.
Long, what did you think of today's conversation?
I find it very informative and insightful. What strikes me the most is the fact that despite all the disruption and social disadvantages, women smallholders consistently show their strength, their creativity, and the desire to move on. This is true for all of the countries that we are visiting, and I find it very beautiful.
True. For me, this was also a lesson in the relationship between traditional farming systems and commercial large-scale agribusinesses. There seems to be a tension between the two all over the world. And traditional smallholder farming systems, which are more in sync with agroecology principles, they are under a lot of stress, but they are very valuable. They have a lot of value. They have a lot of value to offer. And it is worth doing all that we can to try and support them.
Thank you very much for listening to this episode of the TheWaterChannel podcast series. We hope that you found the conversation as interesting and insightful as we do.
We say goodbye here. We'll be back soon with another story, another conversation.
Until then, stay safe and goodbye.